The bucket had been there since first light. It sat at the base of the grand staircase in Ashmore Hall, a plain wooden pail with a rag draped over its rim, the water inside already gray from the marble she had worked since dawn. Cecily Vane did not look up when she heard the footsteps on the upper landing. Footsteps at Ashmore Hall were not her concern. Her concern was the fourth step from the bottom, where a winter's worth of mud had worked itself into the grout, and no amount of soda and warm water had yet persuaded it free. She was on her knees when the Duke of Ashmore came down the stairs. She heard him before she saw him, the measured tread of a man who had learned to move through his own house like a visitor. She pressed herself to the wall and kept her head down, as any sensible charwoman would, the bucket between herself and the railing. His boot stopped 2 steps above her. She did not look up. "Move the bucket," he said. She moved it. He descended past her. She did not breathe until she heard him cross the great hall toward the study, the sound of his footfall swallowed by the distance, and the closed door at the end of the passage. What she did not know, in that moment, was that he had stopped in the study doorway and turned back to look at the staircase. He had not done so because of the gray water or the worn rag or the kneeling figure in the plain brown dress. He had stopped because of her hands. They were bare. She had removed her gloves to work, and the knuckles of her right hand, he had noticed, were raw in a way that was not from cold alone. There were small ink stains at the inside of 2 fingers that no lye soap had fully erased. He stood in the doorway for a moment that was longer than he intended. Then he went in and closed the door. Cecily Vane had been Cecily Ashmore for 7 years, and dead for 5. The marriage had been brief and vivid, and ended badly. Not in the way that marriages of their kind usually ended. Not with indifference or infidelity, but with a carriage road in November and a wheel that had broken on the hill above Hartley Cross. The Duke of Ashmore had been told, at 31 years old, that his wife had gone with the carriage into the gully below. They had shown him her trunk, her coat, her silver comb. They had not shown him a body, because they had not found one. And after 3 weeks of searching in the mud and the cold, he had buried an empty casket in the churchyard at Ashmore-on-Wye and learned to speak of her in the past tense. The world had been kind, in its Regency way. People said she had been charming. They said she had been young and spirited, and now she was gone. And they said the Duke bore his grief with admirable composure. What the Duke bore, in fact, was something considerably heavier and less admirable than composure. He bore 5 years of a question he could not answer. Whether he had failed her. Whether the marriage he had offered her had been worth the brevity of the life she had lived inside it. He had not offered her much warmth. He had been 30 and she 20. And he had come to the marriage from a legal dispute and an estate in debt. And warmth had not been a thing he had thought she required. He had thought she required a house, a title, and a husband who would not squander what her father had given them. He had been correct about all 3. He had been wrong about the warmth. He had understood this only after she was gone. She, who had for 5 years ceased to be Cecily Ashmore, had not gone into the gully. The carriage had gone into the gully. She had been thrown clear in the first jolt, onto the steep bank above the road, and had lain in the mud for a time that she could not later measure, listening to the sounds of the horses, and then to no sounds at all. When she had finally managed to stand and make her way down to the road, the darkness had been complete. There had been no one. The nearest farmhouse was 2 miles north, and she had walked it in a borrowed man's coat she had found snagged on the fence, and she had arrived at the farmhouse door half-conscious and unable, for several days, to speak her own name clearly. By the time she could, She had heard what was being said. Her name was in the county papers. The Duke of Ashmore had buried his wife. She had sat with that for a long time. She had thought, in those first weeks, that she would go back. She had thought of it in the way one thinks of doing the obvious thing, the correct thing, the thing that must be done. She had been in the farmhouse for 3 weeks already, and the farmer's wife had taken her in and called her a poor wandering soul and asked no questions, and she had begun to understand what 5 years of marriage had not permitted her to see clearly, that she had been desperately lonely, not unkindly treated, not cruelly managed, desperately, quietly lonely, in a house full of servants and a husband who looked at ledgers. She had told herself she would go back when she was stronger. She had not gone back. She had gone instead, by slow degrees, south to Bristol, where she found work reading correspondence for a shipping merchant whose eyesight had failed him. She had called herself Mrs. Hartley, which was not so far from her maiden name that it felt dishonest, and not so close that it invited questions. She had spent 2 years in Bristol. Then the merchant died, and his sons required no reader, and she had moved again, this time to Bath, then to a household in Somerset. Then, by the particular cruelty of coincidence that this story requires, back to Wiltshire, to the village of Ashmore-on-Wye, where Mrs. Preston at the coaching inn had mentioned that the great house was understaffed and the new housekeeper was taking on charwomen by the day. She had not intended to take the position. She had needed money, and the inn was full, and it had seemed, for one evening, like a manageable risk. She had been there 3 weeks now. She had not seen his face once in those 3 weeks. She knew his schedule. She had learned it the way she had once learned it inside the house as his wife. The study door closed at 8, open at 1, dinner at 6, the library until midnight. She cleaned the staircase before 8. She cleaned the upper corridor after 1. She had been, in her own estimation, very nearly invisible. If you have ever stood at the edge of a thing you left and looked at what became of it in your absence, you know the particular quality of her attention to that house. She noticed the furniture that had not moved and the furniture that had. She noticed the portrait of his father that had been moved from the study wall to the gallery. She noticed the pianoforte in the drawing room that had been closed and not opened, the lid dusty in a way that told her it had been closed since before she ever arrived as charwoman, closed since long before that. She had left that pianoforte open. She was certain of it. She noticed also what the house held none of the signs of a second occupant. No new duchess. No signs of arrival in residence. No second set of rooms aired and arranged. No feminine gloves in the hall. The house was his alone. And it was, she thought, more orderly than it had been when she kept it. More orderly and considerably quieter. She did not allow herself to dwell on what that meant. If you are staying with this story, you may already have asked yourself what she intended. She had not intended anything. That was the honest answer. She had found work, and she had taken it. And every morning she told herself she would leave before he saw her face clearly. And every evening she told herself she had managed it successfully for one more day. And the days had accumulated, as days do, into a habit that felt less and less voluntary. On the 17th day, she broke the habit. She had been wiping the gallery windows when she heard him come up from the east wing. He moved through the gallery the way he always had, his attention directed toward the door at the far end, not toward the women working along the walls. He had always moved that way, she remembered, as if the house arranged itself around him rather than requiring his attention. He was nearly past her when he stopped. She had her back to him, back, She was reaching for the top pane of the window, and the angle was awkward, and she had pushed her cap back slightly. And she knew, with a certainty she could not explain except by the length of the silence behind her, that he was looking at her. "You," he said. She did not move. "Turn around," he said. This was the moment she had managed for 17 days to prevent. She had no plan for it. She had told herself it would not come, and having told herself that sufficiently often, she had ceased to genuinely believe in its arrival. She turned around. His face was not what she expected. She had expected rage, or confusion, or some compound of both. What she saw instead was a man who had gone very still, in the particular way of someone absorbing a shock they had not prepared for. His color changed, and his jaw set, and his eyes doing something she did not have a word for. "Cecily," he said, her name in his voice. She had not heard it in 5 years. "Your Grace," she said. He stood looking at her for a long moment. A maid passed the gallery door at the far end, and he did not appear to see her. He appeared to see nothing except the woman in the brown dress with the window cloth in her hand. "How long?" he said. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. He said it again, not as a question. His hands were at his sides. "You have been cleaning my floors for 3 weeks. The staircase, mostly," she said. "And the gallery windows. Cecily?" She felt the name in her chest. She kept her expression level. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You owe me," he said, and then stopped. He looked at the far window, the gray November light coming through the glass she had just wiped clean. "Come to the study," he said. "Do not make me ask twice." This was the command she remembered. Not cruel. Not kind. Simply the statement of what would happen in a voice that had learned to expect compliance and had never entirely understood that compliance was not the same as willingness. She followed him. In the study he sat behind the desk by habit, and then appeared to think better of it, and stood instead beside the window, where the light fell on him. She could see him clearly now. He was 36. He was still lean, still dark, his hair a little longer than she remembered at the collar and touched at the temples with something that had not been there 5 years ago. He looked like a man who had worked very hard for a very long time and had not particularly expected to be thanked for it. She stood near the door. "I thought you were dead," he said. "I know." "For 5 years?" "Yes." He looked at her. "Were you injured?" "I was. Not gravely. I recovered." And then she told him because he was owed it. Not the whole of it, not the emotional architecture of it, but the plain facts. The carriage, the bank, the farmhouse, Bristol, the merchant's correspondence, the slow journey south and then back. She told it plainly, as she might have told it to a magistrate. And she watched his face while she spoke, and saw him taking it in with the same expression she remembered from the times she had come to him with household difficulties, the careful management of incoming information before he decided what to do with it. When she had finished, there was a silence. "You chose not to come back," he said. "I did not make that choice in a single moment. And yet the result was the same." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, the result was the same." He turned back to the window. She watched the set of his shoulders, the particular tension she remembered in the space between his neck and the collar of his coat, when something was costing him more than he intended to spend. "I failed you," he said. He said it to the window. "I know that I did. I was not, in those years, a man who knew how to. I have had considerable time to understand what I did not give you, what I failed to offer." She had not expected this. She had expected, perhaps, controlled anger. She had expected the legal and social architecture of what it meant for a dead woman to be alive and employed as a charwoman in her former husband's house. She had not expected this. "Nicholas," she said, and it was the first time she had said his name aloud in 5 years, and she felt it in her throat. He turned. "I did not leave because you failed me," she said. "I left because I was frightened. I left because I had spent 2 years in that house feeling like a guest who had overstayed and did not know how to ask if she was welcome. I left because I was 25 years old, and I had never told you that I did not know if you wanted me there. I left because I was a coward. You were not a coward. I was. What I did took a particular kind of courage, I suppose. But it was the courage of running away, which is not the kind I am proud of." He came away from the window. He crossed the room in the way she remembered, unhurried and direct. And he stopped before her with approximately 18 inches between them, which was the distance he had always managed in the early years of their marriage, propriety and habit and restraint, all requiring that 18 inches, and she could feel in the air between them how much effort that distance was currently costing him. "I want you to stay," he said. His voice was low. Not the level declarative voice of the study and the desk. Something underneath it that had not had air for a very long time. "Not as a charwoman. Not because the law requires it. I want you to stay. Because I have spent 5 years learning the exact dimensions of the mistake I made when I thought warmth was a thing you did not require, and I would like, if you are willing, to spend considerably longer correcting it." She looked at his face. She had looked at this face for 2 years and never quite trusted what she saw in it, and she was looking at it now, and the question she had carried the entire length of her second life, the question of whether there had been anything in him that had ever turned toward her the way a plant turns toward light, was being answered, not in any poetic or elaborate way, but in the way his hands were very still at his sides, because he did not trust them to stay still if they were not actively managed. "The house will talk," she said. "The house," he said, "has been talking for 5 years. I find I no longer care what it says." He reached out then, not for her hand, for the cloth she was still holding, which she had forgotten about entirely, and he took it from her fingers with a care that was almost absurd, given what had just been said between them, and he set it on the corner of the desk, and he looked at her bare hands, the ink-stained fingers, the raw knuckles. "Did no one give you gloves?" he said. "Mrs. Hartley does not receive gloves," she said. Something crossed his face that was, she thought, the nearest thing to the almost amusement she had occasionally suspected him of possessing in the years before. It did not break into a smile. It did not need to. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "will have to be managed." The following week was not simple. Nothing about a dead woman resuming her life is simple, and everything about this particular resurrection was complicated by the presence of the Duke's aunt, Lady Sophronia Dace, who arrived from London on the Thursday with her traveling case and her opinions, and her complete inability to receive surprising news without requiring several days to arrange it into a shape she could present at dinner. Lady Sophronia sat in the drawing-room with a cup of tea that went cold and stared at Cecily with an expression that moved through at least 4 distinct stages of adjustment before settling on something that resembled provisional acceptance. "She was always too thin," Lady Sophronia said to her nephew, as if Cecily were not in the room. "She was always," Nicholas said, his voice perfectly level. "Exactly as she was." Lady Sophronia set down the cold tea. "There will be a great deal of noise from the county." "There will," he agreed. "People will say all manner of things. They will say them with considerably less information than we have," he said, "and they will eventually run out of new things to say and say the old things more quietly. Lady Sophronia looked at Cecily. "You should have come back sooner," she said, which was in its way as close to welcome as the woman was capable of. "I know," Cecily said. "He was," Lady Sophronia said, and then stopped. She picked up the cold tea again. He was not himself for a long while. This was the most the aunt would ever say about those 5 years, and Cecily understood it to be the most that needed to be said. The county did talk. It talked loudly and then less loudly, and some of it was kind and some of it was not. And the portion that was not kind belonged principally to Mrs. Adeline Rowe of Hartley Park, who had been, for approximately 2 of the 5 years, a candidate in the minds of various matchmaking local authorities for the position of Second Duchess of Ashmore. Mrs. Rowe appeared at the Ashmore Village Assembly in December with a new figured muslin and a considerable quantity of composed sympathy. And she said, to no one in particular, and everyone in the room, that it was all very strange, was it not? That a woman who had been dead for 5 years should reappear in her husband's household as a servant. And one did wonder what had truly occurred on that road in November. The room absorbed this. Several people looked at their gloves. Several others looked at their dance cards. Miss Theodora Finch, the solicitor's daughter, who was 19 and did not yet know enough to keep her opinions off her face, looked at Mrs. Rowe with an expression of pure, startled distaste. Cecily was standing near the window with Nicholas when it was said. She heard it. He heard it. The slight pause in the conversation around them was the county's version of collective held breath. Nicholas put down his glass. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped before Mrs. Rowe, and he said, in a voice that was perfectly audible and perfectly controlled, "My wife's history is her own. It is not a subject I permit to be mishandled in my presence. I trust," he said, "that we understand each other." This was not a long speech. It did not need to be. Mrs. Rowe said yes, they understood each other. Her color was high. Her composure, which had been formidable, had developed a small but visible fracture, and she did not, for the remainder of the evening, say anything further about strange circumstances or November roads. The room exhaled. It exhaled in the way rooms exhale when someone of consequence has made clear what they value and what they will protect, and there is nothing ambiguous about either. Miss Theodora Finch turned back to her dance card with something that might have been satisfaction. Lady Sophronia, who had positioned herself where she could observe without appearing to observe, set down her fan with a small, precise click and looked at nothing in particular. Cecily stood by the window and felt for the first time since the carriage on the hill above Hartley Cross that the ground under her was stable. She had not expected this. She had expected, coming back, to have to earn her place back in the world by some gradual accumulation of quiet good behavior. She had expected to be tolerated, rather than claimed. She had thought that was the best that could be managed. And she had thought she could manage it, because she had managed considerably worse. What she had not thought was that he would cross a room in front of the entire county and say her history was not a subject he permitted to be mishandled. He came back to the window. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. After a moment, he picked up his glass again and looked at the room in front of them with the particular expression she had come to recognize over the past weeks as his version of having said what he meant and being content to leave it there. "Your aunt," she said finally, "is staring at us." "She usually is," he said. "She looks as though she is revising her opinion. She revises her opinion approximately twice a year. It takes several days. By Thursday, she will have arrived somewhere she can defend." Cecily looked at the room, at the candlelight on the faces of people she had once known, and then left, and now stood among again. at Miss Theodora Finch's bright 19-year-old satisfaction at the small cleared space around Mrs. Rowe that had formed without anyone appearing to arrange it. "I was wrong," she said, "about whether you wanted me here." He looked at her then, directly, the way he had not quite looked at her in 2 years of marriage and had been looking at her for 3 weeks now, since the gallery window. "You were," he said. "I did a poor job of making it clear. I intend to do considerably better." She believed him. Not because he had said it, but because she had watched him for 3 weeks as charwoman and housekeeper's hire before he knew who she was, and she had seen him notice the raw knuckles and the ink-stained fingers, and she had seen him stop in the study doorway and look back at a kneeling woman whose face he had not yet seen. She had watched him do the thing she had spent 2 years watching for and failing to find, and she had learned it too late to act on it. And then she had been given the strange gift of seeing it again after 5 years had stripped away every other possible reading of it. He had always been turning toward her. She had simply been too frightened and too untaught in the habits of being wanted to believe what she saw. The morning after the assembly, she found the pianoforte open. Not just unlocked. Open, the lid raised and the bench drawn out, and a single sheet of music placed on the stand in the position of something that had been arranged with some care. It was a nocturne she had liked in the first year of their marriage, a piece she had played badly and persistently in the drawing room on winter afternoons, a piece she had not touched since the March before the accident, because she had begun, by then, to doubt whether anyone in the house wished to hear it. She stood in the drawing-room doorway for a long moment. She did not hear him. But she knew, with the same certainty she had always had about where he was, in a room, that he was somewhere behind her in the passage. "How long has it been closed?" she said. "Since November," he said from the doorway. 5 years ago, November." She went in. She sat down on the bench. She placed her hands on the keys, the ink-stained and lye-roughened hands, and she played the first phrase of the nocturne, slowly, feeling for the notes she had let go of. She heard him come in. She heard the door close softly. She heard him sit in the chair beside the fire, the one he had never sat in during those 2 years, the one that put him closest to the instrument and furthest from the desk. She played the nocturne through to the end. By Christmas, the county had reorganized itself. The solicitor, Mr. Holt, had arrived in the second week to manage the particular legal geometries of a dead woman returning to life. And he had done so with the quiet efficiency of a man who had seen stranger things in his practice and had long since stopped ranking them by strangeness. The papers were drawn. The arrangements were made. Lady Sophronia arrived at her revised opinion on a Thursday, as predicted, and declared at dinner that she supposed it had all turned out reasonably well, which was the warmest thing she had ever said in company, and was received accordingly. Miss Theodora Finch sent a note. It said, in 19-year-old handwriting, that she was very glad it had come out right, and that she had thought from the beginning that Mrs. Rowe's figured muslin had been a miscalculation. Cecily laughed at this. She was in the morning room when she read it, the fire lit and the window showing the gray December sky and the elm trees bare. And she was laughing at a note from a solicitor's daughter she barely knew. And she felt the specific lightness of a person who has been carrying something so long that the moment of setting it down takes them by surprise. The bucket had been retired from the great staircase. The maid who normally cleaned the lower marble had returned to it, somewhat bewildered by the interregnum, but adaptable in the way that household staff are always adaptable when management changes. The rag and the bucket were in the scullery, and they would remain in the scullery. And Cecily did not pass the scullery door without a complicated private feeling about what she had thought she was doing when she took that position, and what she had actually been doing which was finding her way back to a place she had been too young and too frightened to stay in. On Christmas Eve, when the house was quiet and the candles had burned low in the drawing room, Nicholas came to find her where she had fallen asleep in the chair beside the pianoforte, a book open on her lap, and the fire down to embers. He stood there for a moment. Then he did what he had not done in 2 years of marriage and had been learning over these past weeks to do. He reached down and closed the book gently and set it on the side table, and he said her name, softly, the way it was meant to be said. And when she opened her eyes and found his face, she saw in it the thing she had been looking for when she was 20 and had not known how to name. "Come to bed," he said. "It is late." It was a command in the shape of an invitation, which was his particular idiom, and she had learned by now to hear what lived underneath it. "Yes," she said, and she rose, and the fire sighed into ash behind them as they left the room together. The pianoforte stood open in the empty drawing room. The music was still on the stand, the nocturne she had played back to life on the morning after the assembly, and the snow had begun to fall outside the window, soft and even, covering the churchyard at Ashmore-on-Wye, where an empty casket had been buried 5 years before. It was, she thought, as she took his arm in the corridor, a peculiar and necessary thing, to find that the life you had fled was the life that had been, all along, the one you were trying to reach. The fire in the upper corridor was still burning. The house held them, as houses do, in its warm and ordinary way. Thank you for staying with Cecily and Nicholas until the end. If this story found something true for you, leave a word in the comments. It means more than you know. She had been in the house 7 days before she learned what the servants called him. Not His Grace, which was what she heard in the corridors when he passed. They said that correctly, in the appropriate tone, with the appropriate deference. What they called him when they were in the kitchen and the doors were shut was the Quiet One. She had overheard it on the 5th day, when Mrs. Carter, the housekeeper, was explaining to a new footman the customs of the household, the hours, the expected behaviors, the particular requirements of a widower who had never quite adjusted to being served by people he felt he was putting to inconvenience. "He does not like a fuss," Mrs. Carter had said. "He never has. He was like that before," the other staff say. "The Quiet One. You will get used to it. He notices everything but says nothing until he must." The new footman had nodded and gone off to polish something, and Cecily had stood in the passage outside the kitchen with her bucket and felt a small, painful thing move through her. She had not known in those 2 years that the servants had a name for what she had spent those years trying to read. She had not known it was legible. She had thought his quietness was direction, directed at the estate, at the accounts, at the management of a house that had been poorly managed by his predecessor. She had not considered that it might simply be his nature, turned toward everything equally, including herself, and that she had been mistaking direction for absence. The 8th day she had been sent to the library. The library at Ashmore Hall was a room she had loved when she lived in it. It occupied the full length of the east wing's 2nd floor, and in the afternoons the light came through the tall, south-facing windows in long, slanted columns that moved across the carpet as the hours passed. She had used to go there in the winters to read, and to be alone in the way one can be alone inside a beloved room. She had spent hours in that library in the 2 years of the marriage, most of them in solitude, and she had never told him she loved it, because she had not thought it would interest him. He was there when she arrived with the dusting cloths. He had his back to the door and a book open on the reading stand by the window, and he did not turn when she entered. She nearly left. She had managed in 7 days to clean around him without being seen, and the library was large enough that she thought she might manage it again. She moved along the far wall, working quietly, keeping to the section of shelving furthest from the window. She was halfway through the third shelf when he said, without turning, "There is a cloth over the rail. The top 2 shelves have not been reached this season." She looked. There was, indeed, a cloth draped over the library rail, left from the last cleaning. She took it down. She climbed the library ladder and began working the upper shelves, and he remained by the window with his book. And the only sounds in the room were the distant sounds of the house, and the soft movement of the cloth along the leather spines. At some point he said, still not looking up, "The third shelf from the right contains correspondence. Be careful of the order." "Yes, Your Grace," she said. Another silence. The light moved. She worked her way along the shelf. "You read," he said. It was not a question. She had stopped for just a moment, at a volume whose title she recognized, and the pause had apparently been sufficient. "I do," she said. "What do you read?" "History, mostly, natural history. Whatever the household I am placed in makes available." A pause. "There are no restrictions on the library," he said, "for staff who make use of it quietly." She had not said anything to that. She had finished the shelf and descended the ladder and returned the cloth to the rail, and she had left the library without letting herself look at the book she wanted. She had gone back that evening. The house was at dinner, and the library was empty, and she had taken down the volume she had stopped at, a natural history of the British Isles that she had wanted to read when she had lived at Ashmore Hall and had never gotten to, and she had sat in the chair by the cold fireplace and read it for an hour in the dim light before she heard the clock in the hall and put it back exactly where she had found it. She had done this 3 more times before the gallery window. She had replaced each book exactly. She had left no evidence of her presence. She thought now, looking back on those evenings, that he had probably known. The library was his. He had said there were no restrictions for staff who made use of it quietly. He had not been speaking in the abstract. He had been leaving the door open. She thought about this in the drawing room on the evening of the 28th of December, 2 days after Christmas, with Nicholas reading in the chair beside the fire and the snow coming down outside the window. She thought about the particular patience of a man who had learned, too late to deploy it during the original marriage, that warmth looked like this: the left door, the identified cloth, the offered library, the notice that she read. She thought about all the ways he had been doing this in the original marriage, without knowing it was what he was doing, the small provisions and protections and provisions that she had been too frightened to recognize as anything other than household management. She put down her book. "You knew I was going to the library in the evenings," she said. He looked up. He had the expression of a man who had been expecting this question for some time and had his answer ready. "I suspected," he said. "You left the book out." "I left several books in positions where they might be noticed," he said. "You chose that one. I thought you might." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire moved. "Did you do things like that before?" she said. "In the first years. Leave things." He was quiet for a moment, the considering silence she had learned to wait inside, rather than trying to fill. "I tried," he said. "I was not particularly skilled at it. I left a shawl in the morning room in February because I had noticed the fire there burned low in the mornings and your gown was thin. You thanked me and set the shawl aside, and I concluded you had not wanted it." She was very still. "I wanted it," she said. "I did not know it was from you. I thought Mrs. Carter had left it." He looked at the fire. "Ah," he said, which was the word he used when something had resolved itself into a shape that was both worse and simpler than he had expected. "I kept it," she said. "The shawl. I took it with me." She had. It was in her trunk in the room she was occupying in the East Wing, a plain wool shawl in dark green, worn thin at one edge, which she had kept for 5 years through Bristol and Bath and Somerset without knowing who had put it there. It was the only thing she had taken from the original marriage, the only piece of Ashmore Hall she had carried with her, and she had kept it because it was warm and because she had been cold for a long time after the accident. And it had felt, in the farmhouse in November, like the one kind thing the world had left her. Nicholas set his book down. He stood up. He crossed to her chair and he crouched beside it, which was not a graceful position for a man of his height and not a posture she had ever seen him occupy. And he took her hands in both of his, the ink-stained, raw-knuckled hands, and he held them for a moment without saying anything. "I would like," he said, "for you not to be cold any more." It was not a poetic statement. It was not an elaborate declaration. It was 11 words in a level voice that had behind it 5 years of a man learning to say what he meant rather than what was sufficient. She felt it land in her chest with the weight of everything she had carried and sat down. "I am not cold," she said. "Not at the moment." He looked at her hands. His thumbs moved along her knuckles, careful of the raw places. "Good," he said. He did not let go of her hands. She did not ask him to. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Ashmore-on-Wye, on the churchyard with its empty casket and its stone that said her name, on the elm trees and the drive and the gray stone front of the house. Inside, the fire was warm. The nocturne was on the pianoforte stand in the next room. The library door was open in the East Wing, as it always was now, as it had perhaps always been, in the way that mattered. She had come home to find it.